I'm going to hit record on this button as well as it just backup just in case. So yeah, so what I was going to do, I don't want to do a big long PowerPoint. I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then I want to get into kind of just a kind of a kickoff question, and I was going to sort of point that at our featured co-lead, who is Zach here. Is Zach not here? I can't do it if
He's
Zach's not
in
here.
and out.
He's in and out. He's in and out. So okay, well I guess we can't do it then. But I guess I could go ahead and introduce everybody to the audience, and then hopefully Zach will be able to get on. I did give him my phone number if he needs to text me, so I'll try to keep an eye on my phone as well. So I'll go ahead and do that. Like I said, I don't have. I'm not going to do a big giant PowerPoint, but I just want to at least introduce the panelists. And we may do that again. We'll see. Okay, so let's do that. I will share the right screen, which is this screen, and we'll share that. And can you guys see that? Yeah, right?
No problem.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. All right, so here's our panel. So Zach is our really the co-lead on this. He's done a lot of work in this space. Has thought about it a lot, written about it a lot. We'll probably reference some of some of his work and maybe try to get some of those into the chat. So I'm going to direct some. Hopefully, if he can get connected, we'll direct some of these questions to Zachary Elwood, who, if you know of his Substack, definitely check it out. Diffusing American Anger. He wrote a book, which Austin, if you want to grab it, I think it's right up there in that stack towards the end. He wrote a book, which we can do there. I'm going to mute Austin real quick. So then here's the rest of the panel. So we've got, I think I've got everybody on here. We got Andrew Van Horn, Travis Monteleone, Cameron Cohen, Ross Yerger, Karen Tamarius, Nimai Dixit, Kelly Johnston, and Jacob Mackey. Got that right this time, right? Yeah. So that's our panel tonight. They're all experts in various things and also very informed in this space. So I'm looking forward to some interesting conversations. I think we've got a little bit of a spectrum in terms of the political spectrum. Here's Zach trying to join now, and I will probably break off this share. Yeah, so this is one of Zach's books. Let me go break off the share. It's a really good book in this space. If you haven't seen it before, how contempt destroys democracy. That's a great book. So hopefully Zach can get connected, and because I want to direct the first question, sort of topic, kind of kickoff at Zach. So hopefully that's going to work. So we'll do that as soon as we can. On that, I have to go here. Where's my shared stuff? Okay. So, Zach, are you able to connect?
According to the chat, he's having audio difficulties.
Okay.
Zach, we could hear you there
Well,
a little bit.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I just switched to another mic. I don't know what's going on. Sorry about that.
No problem. So what I kind of wanted to kick the conversation off with, and we can see where it goes from there, but I wanted to kind of direct it at you to, at least to start us off, Zach, is, we've talked about this before, but I thought I'd sort of bring it up here. We can see where it goes. So, we're sitting here, and there's a lot of folks concerned. I showed that chart earlier. We'll maybe show it again to the audience, but there's a lot of folks concerned about, they feel like, there's threats to democracy, and we're kind of in a crisis and this kind of thing, and they're very worried about that sort of stuff. And, and they're asking themselves even questions: how should I be spending my time? Is bridge building even a thing? Should I be even wasting time on that? Is that like, am I, kind of doing something while Rome burns? And should I be spending my time on that advocacy and activism, or that kind of thing? And how can you do that? If I say I want to express my concern about some of these authoritarian things, can I do that and still be a bridge builder? And again, sort of, why would I want to do that? It's like, it's hard. Doing bridge building is hard. Why do I want to do that? So I guess that's where I would start, Zach. And maybe you can kick us off, 'cause I know you've written about this and we've talked about it a lot.
Yeah, I think, a lot to say there, but I think that our instincts, when we're in conflict, there's a tendency and instinct to think that conflict resolution work is at odds with activism, at odds with pursuing your goals. We tend to think we need these harsh, judgmental approaches when we're angry, when we think bad things are happening. But in my mind, I mean, the thing I try to communicate, and other people try to communicate, is these ideas, these conflict, as I see in political conflict resolution ideas, depolarization ideas, aka bridge building ideas, can live alongside activism. In fact, I think they make any activism more effective, because you're focused more on persuasion and less on venting, and just I think at some level you have to grapple with the fact that we live in an environment with very divergent narratives, right? Like very divergent two main narratives, and you have to, activists, no matter what people think is bad is happening, really horrible things are happening, they have to grapple with the fact that many other people, a large percentage of the country, thinks differently, and you have to think about how your activism is perceived by the people that vote and do a lot of the form the basis of how people gain power. So I try to focus on, in my work, I've tried to focus on how you can fully embrace, bridge building, aka conflict resolution principles, while you do your activism, while you pursue your goals. And I think the more people see that, I think the better we'll be, because I think I see the paths as aligned, in the sense that the more people speak persuasively and try to embrace these principles while they're pursuing their goals, the more our really divergent narratives will kind of come a little bit more aligned, as opposed to being driven farther apart. And that's kind of how I think of it, is these very divergent narratives that keep traveling farther apart. And obviously more contempt is the big driver there. But yeah, that's kind of how I see it in a nutshell, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I dropped in the YouTube chat. I can also put it in our sort of private chat as well. One of your links about recently, I think it's pretty recently, it's like 8 tips on how to do some of this in practice. What is it? 8 tips for activists who want to reduce polarization was one of your recent pieces. I think that's recent. Isn't
Yeah,
that pretty
just a
recent?
few days
Yeah.
ago. Yeah, I wrote it actually, thinking about this upcoming talk. So you forced me to act on that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess anyone who wants, I don't know if a raise hand or somebody just wants to jump in. Does anybody have any further thoughts on that, either that question or anything that Zach raised that they want to add to that? Well, I know, Karen, you do activism, and you're certainly in the persuasion business. A lot of us, I consider myself not particularly in the persuasion business, at least when it comes to persuading towards a certain, political agenda or whatever, right? And I know Connor's Institute, and I definitely want to talk to Jake about that a little bit, because I know Connor's Institute has some of the same sort of goals there, right? But you are unashamed, in the persuasion business, right? But you
Right,
you also try to do it in a not a polarizing way, right?
right. Because I firmly believe that when you uh, don't marry depolarization with your activism work, you're making yourself less effective in our political environment. If you want to make a difference, you need to be talking with people who disagree with you. You need to be trying to persuade them, and the only way to do that effectively is to treat them like fellow citizens with respect and dignity. If we want to save democracy, we have to act like we live in a democracy, and democracy is about giving every citizen a voice, not just the citizens we agree with.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people miss that aspect of potentially how bridge building can improve your advocacy, right? Because if you're working on listening and trying to understand, then you potentially can make arguments that your adversaries can understand, because they get a sense that you understand them better, and you aren't just kind of preaching to the choir with your with these messages that just aren't going to land with anybody with a different
Right.
perspective.
Can I? Oh, I saw Ross has his hand up. I'm going to throw in something real quick, if you don't mind, David, though, directly about that. I think the common objection to that, people will be like, "Well, how can it be if both sides took the approach, how can it be more effective for both? And I think what that misses is that when we improve how we disagree, we'll actually improve the things we disagree about. That's how I think of it, is like we have this way of engaging that drives us apart and polarizes, all these ways of thinking about various issues. We become more team based. We become more us versus them. When the more people take more depolarizing, de-escalating approaches and work that into their activism, I think we'll find that the things that we disagree about will find a more rational, outcome. That's how I view it anyway.
Yeah, and Rich Harwood, he's not really about persuasion, but in the work that they do, which is like civic building together, right? I mean, they find that as a side effect, right? Like when you have to get together with your community and and go work on a problem together, you find this unexpected common ground in places where you maybe didn't expect it, right? Because you have to work together, right? You're going to try to figure this out and come up with some solutions, and you find these other areas that just weren't on your list that you could possibly compromise on.
David, just one cautionary note, and I agree with everything that's being said here. This is all quite good, and I have gone from being a longtime activist and bridge builder to really focusing more on the bridge building part and trying to do a little bit less activism in my world, because I think it's important to really earn the trust of people on both sides to engage in bridge building first. Because I know as somebody on the center right side of the spectrum, over 20 years of trying to work on policy resolution, for example, like convergence and others, it's been very frustrating for me to get people on my side of the fence to engage, because they believe that people on the other side are using, quote, civility to change their points of view. And that's not how this works. So I just want to make that one cautionary note. So as part of the bridge building process, it's really important to talk about the attitudes and approaches before you start engaging in the actual activism. If you start sounding to people in certain quarters like you're just trying to use civility to try to moderate people's views or change their mind, they'll walk away. And I've seen it happen.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right, Ross, sorry, we sort of injected a bunch of stuff before you were able to get in there. Oh, you're muted or something. Your mic's not on.
How about now?
That sounds good.
So I've heard that before, and having that lending the other side a voice and having a radio show that talks politics from both sides of the political spectrum. I see that. One thing I don't see at all is that other side listening to the opposite side. As soon as that other voice, oh, they're talking, I can leave. And where do we see the best example of that? Literally on the floors of Congress. We just had a record-breaking filibuster, and no one was there. That's pathetic.
And some of that is there's disincentives for that, right? They're going to look like they're cozying up to the other side publicly, right? I mean, some of that's our fault, right, for creating that environment that it's like we don't, we discourage our leaders or our representatives from cooperating or even being in the same room with, and I've seen that accelerate now, of course. That's one of the things that concerns me a little bit with, the kind of rhetoric that's changed over the last few months, is you're seeing more now on the Democratic side of people asking, wanting their representatives to be more hardline and more restrict and now never compromise. And, it's even worse, right? So some of that's ourselves for creating this disincentive for folks to do that. Now, I'll say another place where you could really make this stand out that people are talking and not listening is participate in some social media forums.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I would like to cut in and dissent and complain.
Here we go. Of course you would, Cameron.
This will make things much more interesting now. That's the reward you get for what I'm about to say. So I'm a bit of a unique person. I was involved in both the Tea Party and the Occupy movement successively and ran a Tea Party publication. I worked in Republican politics. I've met Mitt Romney personally. I've met lots of Republicans personally. My Republican credentials are in order. And if you want to go hear how I grew up, I had my mom on my show talking about every presidential election she voted in, starting with Jimmy Carter. And I always tell people go listen to the last 15 minutes because this is a normie, non-QAnon, non-crazy white suburban woman Trump voter, and here's why she voted for Trump 3 times. Um, and so I deal with this in my life. Like in Mike, I'm the only liberal in my whole family, and everyone kind of wonders what went wrong with Cameron. Um, I think one of the problems we have with the right and the left, because the readership of the Cameron Journal has always been so diverse, and I'm very proud of that. By the way, I actually had a QAnon Trump supporter work for me. He used to edit the tech section. And I've always been very proud of that. But I think oftentimes we have a narrative problem. And I saw this in start with the Tea Party in 2010, Occupy made it worse in 2011, and social media has completely kind of destroyed it in terms of there's the thing we're talking about, insert issue here, and there's how we talk about the issue. Compromise happens, I call it a delta. Compromise happens in the area between the reality and how we talk about it. And I find the only time I get through with the person who's actually calling my phone right now, is if we get away from the narrative about it and get closer to the actual thing, we find out that there's a lot of stuff that we can agree with more and the conversations are better. When we get too close to the narrative about it, then he's shouting Fox News talking points and I start sending him Rachel Maddow videos. We get nowhere. And then I, on my Saturday newsletter, you should sign up, write a nice long paragraph about a terrible conversation I had with my friend this week. Rinse and repeat. So I think one of the mistakes we made, the Tea Party made one mistake, and that was making it toxic for Republicans to talk to Democrats. And now Democrats are demanding the same, and Democrats are about to make the same mistake 14 years later, but they're about to make the same mistake. The other, I think, problem is we have this sort of odd disconnect in this country when it comes to how we see the world, how we approach problems, all this type of thing. And I think that's very hard to bridge. That was one thing, I think that was the mistake Occupy made, is by making it about the 99%, making it about a class issue sort of thing, and also keeping it decentralized, no leadership, all this type of thing. No one ever took it seriously. It was always a joke. The Tea Party got funding and got into power. I mean, and I lived through both of those things. And so I think when you're talking about advocacy and bridge building and all this type of thing, I think that's all a kind of a good and fair idea. But I think we also have to not make the mistake that Occupy made by choosing issues very carefully, choosing how we talk about them very carefully, and trying to bring people into the middle of that delta, away from the narrative of how we talk about it and closer to the actual thing. We're going to find a lot more agreement on hot button issues like immigration or abortion when we talk about the reality of it. And you need look no farther than all those state reps in Ohio who realized their abortion ban meant women were dying in parking lots. And when the women were dying in the
So,
parking lots, the terrible for them, all of a sudden things changed. That's because we got away from narrative and got to the reality of the situation. So I think how we talk about these things and how we do the bridge building is very important. And now I know everyone wants to say a million things, so I'll shut up. So go ahead.
well, I think that's what this whole talk is about, not the what, but the how, right? I mean, we don't really want to get in debates about specific issues and stuff here. This is more about if you have a position you want to advocate for, how do we do it? And can you do it in a way that doesn't sort of discredit you or make it impossible to do bridge building and this kind of thing, right? And I wanted to ask, and I'm sure other people might want to jump in with some of what Cameron said, but I wanted to ask Jake, I wanted to get this in there before we make sure it gets in there. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Connor's Institute and kind of this simultaneous aspect of the mission, which is to promote democracy and also be nonpartisan, right? So, obviously one way you could say, well, you do that by if whatever administration is there, whatever party it is, you call them out on democracy things, right? And you can say that. But if you're finding yourself calling out one party more than the other because they tend to be the ones suddenly doing the thing, can you be accused of being partisan, or where do you take that?
Yeah, so at the Connors Institute, which I co-direct, but which was really founded by Lawrence Eppard, who's a professor of sociology at Shippensburg University, um, our sort of guiding, observation and idea is that, you know, America is polarized in a bipolar way, right? There's sort of two camps that are in contention, and each camp is sort of splitting off into its own self-contained kind of epistemological silo, if you like, and so it's not that we're in a post-truth era or people don't care about truth. It's just that people have radically different concepts of whom they should trust, who has authority to pronounce truths, and as a result, we don't recognize one another's conceptions of reality, and we even use the word epistemic secession, that the sort of um, two sides in America are seceding from one another epistemically in terms of knowledge and a shared sense of reality. And so, really, we think that democracy can't survive under such conditions. There has to be some broad consensus reality that everyone is capable of agreeing to, and we try to, help produce resources that can help guide people to that reality in a way that's not partisan, right? We try not to, or we're equal opportunity. We attack both sides with equal opportunity, if you like, and we don't try to say that one side is more right than the other side. We try to say, listen, we try to identify the issues and problems on each side, and then we try to, in a very calm, non-attacking way, present the evidence that we think would sort of lead you away from these sort of problematic extreme positions, back to a kind of consensus reality where we can talk together, make democratic decisions together, that'll conduce to a more perfect union. If that makes sense. That's kind of somewhat abstract, but I could talk about the resources we have and whatnot. But yeah.
Well, and I don't want to spend the whole night on this, but I want to say that I feel like some of that itself can be partisan, right? I mean,
Yeah.
or at least can be accused of
Interpreted.
being partisan, right? It can be
Sure.
interpreted that way, right?
Absolutely.
Where you say
Absolutely.
like, well, just the fact that you're telling me there's two truths, just the fact that you're telling me
Mm.
you want me to be have better news literacy, or even just the fact that that improves societal well-being. I mean, some people make all that stuff partisan, right? I guess we can't do anything
Hmm.
about that, but it's almost
Hmm.
impossible to sort of even I don't know. I guess the best you could do is say I don't have the better word than nonpartisan, but there's something else there because this Connors Institute also talks about being not in the game of persuasion, but in some sense
Hmm.
you are, because you're trying to persuade people that information matters.
Yeah. I mean, any kind of speech act is inherently rhetorical and persuade. It's an attempt to persuade, right? You're trying to persuade someone that something
Right.
is true, that this is so. So there's really no speech that's not persuasion, but the idea is that we're not attempting to do political manipulation, right? And that's the idea. And if there will always be people we will fail to appeal to, right? But there's a principle in, I guess, economics, bad money drives out good, isn't that right? Where people will hold on to their good money but spend the bad money. And there's a similar thing that happens in our information economy, where so at a certain point, all you get circulating in the economy is the bad money. We've kind of got that going on in our information and political economy right now, where all that's circulating is very extreme kind of views. Um, the sort of loudest, brashest, the sort of craziest voices on each side are the ones that get amplified, and the people with the good opinions, the more grounded, solid, temperate opinions are sort of hoarding that and hanging on to that as if it were good money, if that makes sense. Um, we're trying to put good money back into circulation, if you will. And yeah, you're going to lose some people on either side who are going to say, no, well, what you're doing is just partisanship. You're just shilling for the Democrats, or you're secretly a Trump supporter or something like that. And um, yeah, we try to
Yeah.
have calm conversations with such people and see if we can win them over, but we can't always.
Well, I do want to get to a couple things going on the YouTube, but because we haven't heard from Nimai yet, he's got his hand raised. Let's hear from Nimai now, and maybe jump to Ross and or Jurgs, and then maybe we can take a look at a couple things in the YouTube comments.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, I have a bunch of thoughts racing through my mind. I'll try to keep it succinct, but I think to what Jacob was saying, I think kind of the first place I start is like I totally agree with him in terms of the problem of these sort of epistemic silos that are being created. Like people are almost living in different worlds, and I almost like the first thing I try to remind myself is I don't think there's any easy solution to this. You know, it's like you almost have to like step back and be like, if I'm in subconsciously looking for like an easy path through this, I don't think it exists. I think it's actually, you know, a decent amount of work to counteract what's happening here. And just to sort of tie it back to the original question about balancing activism and bridge building, I think bridge building is actually trying to be that counteracting force, you know, that in the world of narrative, media, et cetera, there are these bubbles that are being formed, and through whatever people have their theories, algorithmic feedback, whatever, people are getting more and more driven into their particular silos in the virtual world. Uh, and bridge building is almost like in the real world, let's start trying to, and also virtual world, let's start trying to like connect people consciously with people who have different perspectives. Let's try to get different perspectives consciously to start colliding in as safe a place as we can make. And I think, you know, I think it's useful to sort of have clear definitions in your mind about these things. Like for me, being passionate about an issue doesn't necessarily make you an activist, right? An activist is somebody who's chosen to really work towards some goal, some practical goal. Like they've taken up some issue and they're trying to work towards maybe some policy change or something like that. And that's a role that they've taken on. I think if you're if you're passionate about something, I think you should bring that into bridge building conversations. You know, what are you trying to build a bridge between, right? You're trying to, it's going to sound a little corny, but you're trying to build bridges between hearts and minds, right? Like how can you do that if you're not honest about how you actually see things? If you're in a desire to like, you know, keep the peace, you're never actually making yourself vulnerable and saying what you actually think. I don't think you can actually build a stable bridge if everybody behaves that way. And so, but that means you are making yourself vulnerable, and there is a risk, and you could get hit, you know, and that's kind of a. But I don't think there's a way around it. You know, at some point, sometimes you have to be willing to take that risk and sort of extend that vulnerability in the hopes that maybe, you know, the people listening to you will appreciate it, and then you can actually start building some real solid bridges. And just the last point, I do think it's possible to actually be an activist and do bridge building. It would be very dynamic. It's harder to balance. It's obviously easier to just do the one thing and not, you know, do the other. But I do think you pick up certain skills in both domains. This is my guess. I haven't done much activism in my personal life, but my sense is it would make you more dynamic in both arenas if you could figure it out. But it's tough. It makes it harder to figure out to decide to do both of those things. Anyway, those are my thoughts.
Yeah, you know, and I personally know people, you know, we've been having a lot of back channel conversations in this space. And I personally know people that are like, I'm going to abandon this bridge building thing because I feel like, you know, these problems are too big and I need to go focus all my energy there. And I know people that have literally done that. Like they shut down what they were doing and they started a whole new thing. And I think in some of those cases, they actually are sort of still bridging because of the way they're doing the advocacy they're doing, but they've like, you know, sort of said that like, I can't do that. Like these problems are too big. So, you know, I want, Jake, you want to jump in?
Just on this point of, you know, meeting with people with whom you greatly disagree and sort of putting yourself out there, taking that risk, being honest about where you're coming from. I'm sure everyone in this call knows about Braver Angels, right? They do that work. They put people together, and people are, you know, the idea is that you can be your authentic self. You can be your authentic blue, you know, pro-choice, you know, uh, pro-trans rights, whatever it is, and you meet with someone who thinks the election in 2020 was stolen and that the January 6th people should be pardoned, and you can talk and you can come to some kind of rapprochement and find common ground. It's a great organization. Just wanted to do that plug.
Oh, and I'll say along those same lines is I'm also a trained moderator, a certified moderator for a group called Crossing Party Lines. And we
Mm,
do we do that same kind of thing. We do conversations and we do it on an ongoing basis. So you don't just
mm,
sort of go to one meeting and say, now I'm fixed.
mhm,
You do it
mhm.
ongoing. And yeah, and I'm actually hosting one on China on Thursday night with Crossing Party Lines, if you want to look that up. And not hosting, I should say, I'm moderating a conversation there. Yeah, same kind of idea. Yeah, and those things are great because, yeah, you get to really practice it because that's a problem with a lot of that kind of stuff is that it's not natural, right? You actually have
Mhm.
to learn how to do it and practice it because if you try to do it the natural way, you're gonna fall down the psychological rabbit holes and get yourself in trouble. But by practicing it and following, by having a moderator there to kind of keep the guardrails in place, stuff like that. So, Jurgs, let's let you jump in, and then I want Zach, if you could sort of think about. I want to introduce these comments from Bill, and then Zach, you can maybe comment on those. I put them in the chat, in the Zoom chat. Go ahead, Jurgs.
Uh, just a point to take us back about 15 minutes, but we talked about bias. Uh, when I worked in the San Francisco field office for my prior life, I got to see Ann Garrels from NPR and attend her book signing, Naked in Baghdad. And being a female journalist, there was a very heavy lady audience at the book signing at the Q&A portion. And one lady gets up, congratulates her, thanks her for being such a strong, independent, bipartisan, uh, independent journalist. She shook her head no and said there's no such thing. I can be as impartial as I can try to be, but as I report on the war in Iraq, I can be sitting aside of another female reporter or male reporter or any other very qualified reporter can be watching the exact same thing, tell you a very different story, and nobody is more or less wrong than the other. And that's like the listening. I think that's something else that's often forgotten about. That just because some facts are left out doesn't necessarily mean, excuse me, doesn't necessarily mean it's a lie of omission. They're just not there.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And if none of us can really say, yeah, we're 100% unbiased. Like we're bringing our biases to the table. We can't help it. Um, so yeah, I just want to talk about a few things about Bill. I put a couple of his comments from the YouTube in the Zoom chat there. And what, I want to say is Bill's a podcaster, and we've known each other for a while. And I know he was, really struggling with Trump winning the election, right? And I know it's been difficult to kind of find his place and stuff. And I may be overstating for Bill, but just to kind of give you some context, what would you say to Bill with his comments there, Zach?
I mean, I'll try my best to do it off the cuff because it's always better to think it through. But I would say the these are the same kind of messages we've been hearing since 2016. I think like the idea that things have gone too far on both sides. We would hear this kind of thing like things have gone too far. We have to take more aggressive approaches. And I would just ask, what do you think? What kind of approaches are you advocating specifically, and do you think that they would be effective? Right? Like that's the question. Is like when people say we can't abide by the normal rules. It's like, well, what specifically are you proposing, and how do you think that would play out? Because I would argue this kind of impulse to disregard that there are a lot of people who think differently. For example, and this might be a good time to pass it to Kelly, who might be able to channel the pro-Trump perspective more. But we just have to grapple with the fact that Trump, no matter how bad you think he is, no matter how bad you think any leader is, they derive their power from a population, and many people have arguments for why they see Biden and Democrats behaving undemocratically and breaking rules, right? So we just have to grapple with the fact like everybody's going to do what they're passionate to do, right? They're going to pursue the things they want to pursue. But I would just ask, what are these rules that we're saying need to be done differently, or I guess that's to make it specific. It's like, what exactly are people proposing? Are they proposing going out and doing a specific form of protest in the street? I just like to get specific, about what's being proposed, and to ask about, do you think would that specific approach make things more polarized and actually, inadvertently lead to more support for the people you dislike, or will it bring, are there different ways to pursue your thing, even if it might take longer? It might be more less polarizing. Those are just my rough thoughts, roughly, probably awkwardly phrased, but yeah.
Yeah, and I like one of Bill's comments. It's hard to mount a defense if you do not understand what your opponent wants or desires. That's something we've all talked a lot about. Andrew.
Yeah, I think that is a really good point about sort of what are you proposing. I feel like this is always this is always the conversation that I hear from any set of people, like from either side, quote unquote, of the quote unquote political spectrum. When the other guys are in power, there's always this discussion like, we don't, our problem is we don't play dirty the way they play dirty, and we don't, we don't break the rules, we always play by the rules and all that. And not to put too fine a point on it, but bullcrap. um, right. Everybody's politicians, play dirty. Number one, and it's just when they are doing the dirty playing, you think it's justified, and so you go along with it. And when the tables are turned, and then now the other guys are playing dirty, right? It's, well, we're always doing good, and why don't we play dirty like these guys? And that's, I think, a really like hard that's like the really hard sort of nut to crack here, is getting folks to realize that, like, the perspective of other people, right, is that their guys are always the guys that are not playing dirty, right? So they think just the same way that you do. And so when Trump is playing dirty like he is right now, right, they think that's fine, and it's quite possibly the kind of thing that we would think would, I say we, as if we were progressives, we would think that was okay, right? Or when when someone like Trump is doing it, then conservatives think that's okay, and et cetera. So I think it's a good place to sort of think about the ways that ideologies push us to act in the same way no matter what.
Yeah, if I could just chime in also, I think those are all great points. There's definitely a tendency to assume that there's a lot of coordinated malice going on, in the Trump administration from folks on the left. And I think a lot of times what actions you're seeing can really just more easily be chalked up to incompetence. And I would just warn people to not assume that there's malice when the same events can be explained with simple incompetence. I think that's a good general heuristic. And that, the base case for folks on the left who aren't happy with the current Trump administration, I think, should be not that they're going to bring the republic down and democracy down, but that an incompetent administration might bumble along for 4 years, and there might be a little bit of damage here and there, but in general, institutions will hold, and the next administration will come in afterwards, and things can get back to normal, right? Assuming that the worst is right around the corner is a tendency I think all humans have, and typically we're wrong with that assumption. That gets to our negativity bias, which I write on Substack, and that's basically my big shtick, is the importance of negativity bias to polarization, and how it really warps our perceptions of reality. Going back to what Cameron was talking about, there's a big gap between events as they really occur and events as depicted in the narratives that we choose to believe. And the narratives that we choose to believe tend to be way, way overly exaggerated, negative, outrageous, sensationalist. And that is all because of negativity bias, right? subconsciously attracted to the negative to a very large degree. And so I think that's true, when the left is thinking about the current Trump administration. It's also true, right, with the right thinking about the prior Biden administration. And it goes back multiple administrations, all the way really back to the beginning of U.S. history. And so a lot of times if, folks on the left today are saying, well, maybe we should stop playing by the rules. If you ask people on the right why they're okay with, presumably not playing by the rules now, they'll typically point to things that were done in the last administration that they view as also not being according to the rules. And so there's a back and forth that really goes all the way back, at the very least, to the 90s. And to break that cycle, I think, one, we need to be much more aware of our own negativity biases and viewing the others as more negative than they are, and also just be much more willing to take the high road and play by the rules. Because otherwise, the institutions that we've built up over 200 years will quickly get eroded.
I know Karen's waiting
100
to.
React that, like with the. Do they have 100 React for that?
Yeah,
I know Karen. I know Karen.
Fantastic, right.
Yeah, we want to get to Karen, but
I know.
we'll get to Karen in just one sec. I'll add to that a little bit. That's been escalating, like you say, for a long time. It's not just negativity bias, but what we're seeing is this actual sort of moral limits have changed too, right? What we once considered amoral, or wouldn't consider it moral, now we do, because we think the other side did it, or they really did do it in our perception. And so that's been escalating, and that is a cascading problem that a lot of us talk about and are aware of, and it's kind of a challenge. But
real quick, David, could I throw something in, just like a real quick thing?
Yeah.
Because I wanted to say, I think a common objection that some people listening would have is like, well, what if I'm really sure that they one side or the other is doing really bad harm? I think to Travis's point and what Andrew was talking about, I think it's important to recognize, like, even if these ideas about political conflict resolution still hold, even if you're like 100% sure that the other side is doing massive harm. I mean, look at somebody like Abraham Lincoln, who behaved in pretty depolarizing ways. He spoke in depolarizing ways, even in war, So I think I just want to throw in there, because a lot of people will be like, no, I'm very sure that very bad things are happening. I think it's important to recognize, even no matter who's right on that front, I think the ideas still apply.
Yeah, and like we often talk about, and you certainly often talk about, is this idea that these things aren't symmetric, right? They don't have to be symmetric, and you still want to apply some of these approaches. Yeah, Karen, sorry, I know you've been waiting for a while.
Yeah, well, you were kind of stealing some of my lines.
Sorry about that.
So the first thing I was going to say is we have to keep in mind the cognitive bias, which causes us to think that the solution to our problems has to be proportional to the problem itself. And in reality, often really big problems can be solved with minor changes. And in this case, I would say a minor change in our behavior. But another thing to think about is when we talk about, well, we have to do something more extreme. I agree with Zach that the question comes up, what is that? Often when I ask people that, the answer is, well, we need to do something violent. And my answer to that is, well, two things. One is that actually civil disobedience is an option long before we get to violence, and it's perfectly consistent with all of the principles that we're talking about here in terms of how you engage with people you disagree with. And then I would add that what research shows in that regard is that actually civil disobedience in these cases is far more effective than any other response. So Erica Chenoweth's research showing that all it takes is 3.5% of the population to actively resist an authoritarian government for it to fall. And that works more than resorting to these extreme actions like violence. So this is perfectly consistent with a powerful response. And if we're thinking that this isn't powerful, we are lying to ourselves.
Yeah, there's also a lot of misperceptions or misconceptions, I should say, about that 3.5%. For a lot of people sort of get that wrong, but yeah, no, it's definitely there. And one thing you mentioned there is it's sort of like a sustained thing, and it's not just like you show up to one protest and
Oh
this
yeah.
magically happens. It's a lot of stuff, and it's more than protest. But so I want to make sure, since we're already getting up to the hour, I want to get a few more things out of from uh, from the YouTube chat. So we've got Long COVID MD. She's a medical doctor, and she's been helping folks with long COVID understand what's going on with that and try to come up with solutions. And she says that Cameron's comments make me wonder about the power of ideology versus practical reality. People seem to be increasingly ideological, even in the face of bad outcomes. And I think that comes back to something Cameron said. I think a couple other people sort of picked up on that. Anyone want to run with that one?
I'll jump in.
Go for it.
Since I'm always yeah, if there's anybody who's going to rail against ideology, it's probably going to be me. Um, if you want more anti-ideological railing, pragmatic underscore nihilist on Instagram. Yeah, I think Cameron made like a really amazing point about the way that we talk about things, um, and the reality of things versus the way that we're talking about them. And I think one of the biggest problems with the way that we talk about things is talking about them in terms of the political spectrum, or this sort of one-dimensional line of political orientation, that just is really useless, and other than as a means of dividing people, it is completely useless. um, and the more we can get away from that kind of thing, the better off we're going to be. And I think a lot of this, what we call polarization, is really a result of these kind of almost sort of structural factors. One of them is that idea, right? That idea of that there's this one-dimensional thing that, or even two-dimensional, right? With the political compass, right? That you can somehow orient yourself in political space, and but it's all really and there's a really great book by Hiram and Verlyn Lewis called The Myth of Left and Right, and they talk about this, that the the notion of the political spectrum. I mean, this is something that was basically ported to American politics in the 20s and 30s. Coming from just describing like European socialism, right? They brought it here. It really just was about like the size of government at first, and then we started sort of tacking things on, willy nilly, and it doesn't really actually reflect the way that people think about individual things, right? Individual issues. And that's where we need to get away from, like Cameron said, away from the narrative, and to where we're talking about the specific issues at hand and dealing with those issues on their own terms as unique in individual issues, and not as an ideology, right? And so what this ideology thing has sort of become is, it's a way of um, uh, you know having a team, right? Having our team all believe in this one thing, and then telling ourselves a story about why we all believe that thing, right? And
Like post hoc, yeah.
this post hoc, rationalization of why, oh, we believe all of these things because we are empathetic, right? Because those other people don't have empathy. You know what I mean? Like, that doesn't make any sense. So, or we have common sense, which, like I barely keeping my eyes forward focusing, and not just like rolling all the way into the back of my skull. But but yeah, so I think that's, yeah, I'll stop. But I think that's a place where we can really, if we can change the way we talk about things in that realm, like with, like talk about things in this more complex way, we're going to be in a much better shape.
Yeah, and it's hard because all this language is just everywhere, and it's the way everybody wants to look at the world. So you have to kind of sort of come up with some new language. I want to do a little housekeeping because we're coming up on the hour. I want to get to another, at least one more in the YouTube chat. You have a particular one you want to cover? So, yeah, but I wanted to say that because we're coming up on the hour, I was going to let anybody who feels like, it's 10 o'clock on the East Coast, if you need to roll out, feel free to do that. Anybody who, if we, feel like we want to chat a little bit longer, I'm happy to stay longer. And so if you're able to and want to hang on, that would be great. If not, though, I want to make sure I respect your time and feel free to jump out at the top of the hour. So Natasha in the YouTube chat has two things that I think kind of go together. So she says, I'd love to hear folks' thoughts on what good democratic idea exchange looks like. We talked a little bit about Braver Angels, so that might be part of it. At the most local level, what sorts of practices over what sorts of timeframes, ideally? And then also, to what extent do you think other forms, methods of community building are important to developing lasting, scalable bridge building efforts? And before we go to anybody else, I mean, I'll say this local community stuff is really huge. Like if you can work even in your like HOA or something, right? Get to know your neighbors and work on problems together there. Go work in the shared garden area somewhere, just spend time with these people and work together to do stuff. That's it. That's a huge one. I mean, this goes then sort of scale that all the way up to national service and things like that. I'm a huge proponent of all that. And I think those are great ways to understand each other better and that kind of thing. So probably some others have some comments on that too. Nima, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I can give some thoughts on those two questions. On the first one, like what does good democratic exchange look like? I'll give a specific idea, but just to step back and give like a framework. I remember, I think it was an Instagram reel or something that I saw a while back, but it really affected me where they were talking about martial arts, and the person was talking about how do you actually learn martial arts, and they were like, the way it happens is you learn how to do a punch, then you learn how to do, maybe a hook, then you learn how to do a kick. Okay, you learn like little elements, and then as you become more advanced, you learn how to start stringing them together and making them more complex, right? So you learn some basic skills, and then you start stringing them together to make them more complex until eventually you have this kind of competence, this that to somebody else would look like it's like almost like natural to you, but it's like you're able to perform very complex tasks and do things like that. And I think having good conversations is very much like that. Debating well is very much like that. Debating in a way that actually is likely to be productive rather than destructive is something like that. I think there's like lots of different skills that you need to sort of pick up and start stringing together. And for example, one I'll just give maybe two quick ones that people consider. I think one really important skill is if I'm, let's say, having a conversation with somebody that I disagree with on an issue, can I actually articulate their position in a way that they would say, yeah, I think you understand where I'm coming from, Not like dismissively, like, yeah, here's bullet point, that's what you believe, set it aside. Now let me tell no, like, can I articulate it in a way where I can actually hit the sort of emotional triggers or the emotional sort of anchors that really anchor that person's worldview? Can I really demonstrate that, like, yeah, I get it where you're coming? And that's very hard to do because in order to do that, I have to kind of set my own worldview aside for a second and actually do that. But I think if you can do that, and I've experienced this myself and I've seen it, that it actually neutralizes a lot of the potential like hostility that may be there underlying the surface. And now you can actually maybe have a conversation about it. And that doesn't mean the other person will agree with you, but it improves the likelihood that it's a healthier discussion. Another one, I'll just point people to a great essay by this venture capitalist, Paul Graham. He wrote an essay called How to Disagree, which I think has a lot of interesting ideas in it. I'll just sort of leave that. And then the other thing on I think it was sort of non-conversational, different kinds of community building. I also think, for the people in this group and for everybody in the country, we're so focused. There's so much of this underlying thing of like political disagreement and debate and trying to prove our point. But like, there should also be spaces in your life where you're just sort of spending time with people around you, invite the neighbors over for dinner. Like, that's also part of life. Everything in life doesn't have to be consumed into this sort of vortex of debate and proving your point. And I think more people should do that. And another quick article I'll point people to. There's a blogger named Noah Smith, I think it is. I forget exactly what it is, but he wrote this great article about there are horizontal communities. We have horizontal communities in our life, and we have vertical communities. Horizontal communities are like the people physically that we live around. And vertical communities are like people we're connected with based on interests, hobbies, ideology, those kinds of things. And he's like, for most of human history, our main communities were our horizontal communities. It was very hard to find people who, we shared interests with or ideology with, that kind of thing. But in the current age that we live in, it's actually become very easy to build vertical communities, and our horizontal communities are eroding. And I think that's sort of an underlying, hidden, invisible cause of a lot of the problems that we're discussing. So we have to sort of consciously work to sort of reinvigorate those horizontal communities, and that requires work. We have to actually decide. It's like unpaid work. You're not going to get paid for it, but it's a necessary kind of job that people should think about doing. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
I would
Yeah,
like to bounce in on this. Sorry, David. With something Karen mentioned about violence and civil disobedience being more perspective, and of course she's absolutely right. Many a regime has fallen without nary a shot fired. However, I think given what has transpired over the last 9 years, I feel like many people see this as that ship having very much sailed. Which, and I wrote in January, I said, I feel like we're going in to the time of lead, which is a reference of a series of terrorist attacks that took place in Italy in the 1970s when things were very politically fractious. And I said, I feel like that's kind of where we're going through because I have people on the right who will say that, January 6th was entirely justified because the left burnt down the country in 2020 over George Floyd. And I feel like when a lot of these things we've kind of I think things are very precarious right now because a lot has happened. Sort of disparate things have happened. And so I think things are very precarious. And sometimes I think right now in this moment, one of the complaints about Democrats, the left more broadly, is we're too polite, we're too institutions, we're too into process and complaining about paperwork, whereas the Republicans are burning it all down. Now, if you call my Republican friends, they'll say the opposite about themselves. So this is this is the problem I'm talking about. But also I feel like it's a very difficult time to bring people together, um, because you have people in I mean, we have the left defending free trade. If you told anybody in 2002 that was a thing, we would have all laughed in your face. Like, I'm like, I'm old enough to remember when we were protesting in Seattle at the WTO. Like, I mean, how the tables do turn, and now all of a sudden I was like, I'm having to write full-throated defenses of globalization when in my first book I wrote 2 essays bemoaning globalization, but yet here I am, that's the Trump effect, writing about globalization, and so I think so much has happened and so much has changed. I think we're in very uncharted territory and very uncharted waters. And obviously everything says is great and amazing. And I think bridge building and horizontal community work is very important. And that's why I love local government to some degree, because at the state level and below, you actually have to do things. Like the water has to flow, the lights have to turn on, you have to drive on the roads, so you actually have to get stuff done. So in state legislatures, you have Republicans and Democrats who have to work together because the government, the lights have to stay, you gotta do the stuff. And I think that's very helpful, but I think we're in I think the political moment we're in is rather baked in. I think part of the left and right problem, I forget who made this point, is that it was imported in the 20s and 30s. Is our system was not built for this. Our system was not built to only have two parties. Our system was not built to have this sort of left-right ideological divide that works great in European parliaments, but doesn't even work with how our national legislature works. And I think, unfortunately, because it's a convenient way to talk about it, it's a convenient way to conceive of it, all this sort of thing, we've gotten locked into a language, an ideology, a system, an idea that doesn't even work with how our government actually works. And so people are looking for a level of responsiveness or envying other systems that it does not work with Madisonian federalism or the republic that we have created. And I think we're in a time where most of my right friends are happy it's burning because, as far as they're concerned, the country left them behind 20 years ago. So let it all burn. And a lot of my leftist friends, we find ourselves suddenly defending the institutions we used to complain about in college. Again, how the tables turn. So I honestly, I appreciate what everyone's saying, but boy, I find it very hard to move forward. I worry about what does this look like next year? Like, I'm already at that place of like, what is this going to seem like by Christmas? They've been in office 3 months, and it's, I mean, it's been 3 months on Saturday. What does this look like by Christmas? I mean, I think we're in a very difficult time, and I don't necessarily know, despite the wonderful suggestions of everyone here, how we overcome that. I mean, it's a lot. It's a lot.
Just hop in here. Getting back to some of the practical, ways to democratically exchange ideas. Natasha, I thought that was a great question and agreed with a lot of Nimi's points. So just to add a couple of more that I use very frequently in debates with friends and acquaintances and stuff. I think it's super important to remember that the winner of any debate is pretty much always going to be the person who asks more questions. And that's not just, something that people say so that people will ask questions to learn about the other side and to really understand where they're coming from. That is important. It's good to understand where they're coming from. It's good to be able to articulate their position. But even, a step beyond that, the person who wins the debate is typically going to be the one who really gets the other person to question their own beliefs and really think about their underlying assumptions and epistemology, like Jake was talking about earlier. Really, the Socratic method is what this is, and debate should be something that is a lot more difficult than just vomiting all of your beliefs at someone and hoping that they pick up, the vomit and come to see your conclusion. Never pretty much has that worked, right? People just butt heads. You've got the backfire effect where once you start going head to head with someone, they'll typically dig in their heels and will, at the end of the debate, believe what they, the position that they were taking more strongly than they did at the beginning of the debate. And so just arguing back and forth is typically not going to be very successful. It's much more effective to ask questions, get at underlying assumptions, learn about the other person, sure, but really Socratically, um, break down their beliefs and then get them to, I mean, it's almost like inception, right? You're getting inside their brain and getting them to question their own beliefs to the point that you're actually reaching a conclusion together that's cathartic in a lot of ways. But you do that through questions, not through vomiting facts and statistics typically. So the questions I think is really important. The other thing is that even, before you get into a debate, really making sure that you yourself are looking yourself in the mirror and making sure that you're not stuck in an echo chamber without even knowing it, right? Because the vast majority of people who are stuck in an echo chamber don't realize that. And so one thing I've talked about and written about before is something I call the 552 test, which I think is just a good, simple heuristic to see whether or not you're in an echo chamber. And so for myself, I'm center right. The 552 test for me would be number one, do I have five close friends who are on the left? Okay, very simple, very low bar. If not, it's not good. Number two, do I have five beliefs that are actually left leaning, or are all of my beliefs also right leaning? If all of my beliefs are right and I consider myself right, that's not good. Even though I consider myself right, most people will have some left-leaning views, and so you should be able to document and categorize those. And if you don't have at least five, that is probably an indication that you're also in an echo chamber. And then finally, the two, do you have at least two news sources that you regularly consume that are left-leaning, right? So the 552, if you can't pass that, probably not a good sign. Could be good to strive to get to that point where you've got, five friends, ideas, and two news sources all kind of on the opposite side. So just a couple of additional ideas there. I think the practical applications of all this is a really, really good question.
I'm going to say a couple things about Cameron, sort of the switching sides on the issue, like having to change a position on an issue. That really gets to exactly what Hiram and his brother talk about in that book, The Myth of Left and Right, right? That we in order to stay in our tribe, sometimes we'll have to change our position, right, to stay in the tribe that we're in. And I think you might enjoy that book. So yeah, it's called The Myth of Left and Right. I'll also say another book on this idea, some of the stuff that Travis was just saying. If you want to look at, there's a lot of books on these topics, but I think it's one of the good ones on this idea of this epistemic changing persuasion type stuff that works. Like it's not like old advertising persuasion type stuff, but deeper. Is a book called How Minds Change by David McCraney. That's a pretty good book on this topic. I think I have a copy of over there somewhere. Um, that's one I do. And so yeah, so go ahead, Karen.
Sure, great. I just wanted to follow up on Travis, and I used to be a champion debater when I was back in high school, and I basically have spent my time since then unlearning everything I learned as a debater. And basically, the conclusion that I've come to about debate is that it isn't designed for conversation. It isn't designed for your average everyday interpersonal interaction. Debate is great for talking to juries. Debate is great for talking to legislatures. It's designed for situations where there is a person making a decision or a group of people making a decision who are trying very hard to be impartial. That is not what our conversations are like. Human beings are coming to these conversations with very strong, deeply held beliefs about how the world should be and how it works. And so we need an entirely different system for having those types of conversations and going in and changing minds. The big revelation for me came when I realized that I was already using a system that changed minds, that was nothing like a debate, when I realized that that's what psychotherapists do. Psychotherapists are in the business of helping people change their minds without telling them what to think, right? I never go into a session with a client and say, you know what you really need to do? You need to leave your husband. I don't go in and say, you know what, you really spent too much time worrying about, what college your children are going to get into. And I certainly never go into a conversation with a patient saying, you know what, I got to tell you, you don't have a microchip planted in your brain. All of those things are going to backfire. It doesn't matter, who the patient is, how in touch with reality they are, or how out of touch with reality they are. The conversation has to work very differently. And yet I'm able to help them. And I'm able to help them through the ways that Travis is talking about, which is largely through a Socratic method, asking questions and eliciting their responses so that they can figure out what's best for them. But there's another component that we often neglect, I think, in the discourse space, which is emotion, connection, feeling, relationships. And that's the other thing that makes change work within the psychotherapeutic relationship. No matter who my patient is, I come to that relationship with positive regard. They might be a murderer. They might be locked up in San Quentin. And I've worked with patients in San Quentin, and I still am going in there, valuing their humanity, treating them with dignity, and looking forward to helping them improve. So that's how we need to enter the political space.
Yeah, I mean, we're not exactly here to solve that problem, but yeah, and I honestly, I know you know this, but I wanted to just add to it that, like you said, people come into these things with strong beliefs. It's really kind of a combination of beliefs, attitudes, and values, right? And you've got to sort of negotiate all of that. And something else that you think about the psychotherapist kind of analogy in these kind of things. A lot of what you're doing, if you're trying to understand people and try to get them to at least think about, make them defend it to themselves, right? So it's like creating that space for them to begin questioning themselves, right? That's what a lot of it is about, right? It's really just creating that space. And it can be really hard to do, right? Because we want to tell them what to do. We don't, but a lot of it is creating that space. I want to let Austin, my co-director, follow up with something that Travis was speaking about.
Yeah, and I think this goes
Maybe get closer to
to
the mic.
what Karen was just mentioning as well. But this idea of, okay, taking sort of when we have these conversations and bringing it to activism sort of more broadly, right? We've had a lot of talk within this panel about activism and connecting it to persuasion, connecting it to debates, connecting it to getting people to perhaps question the beliefs that they hold. And I was just wondering what our panelists think about, is that what activism is? Is activism about persuasion? Or perhaps when it comes to these issues, we should be looking at activism as advocacy rather than focusing on when we're being activists, convincing someone else who might not agree with us to agree with us, to use activism to advocate for the ideas that we hold and whether or not, and sort of why people who might not disagree with us should at least listen to us. And if they're convinced for themselves, then that's great. But if they're not entirely convinced, at least get them to understand that there are people out there who hold views that aren't necessarily the same as theirs, and to get them to at least listen and take those opinions seriously. So I'm curious what our panelists have to say about that.
Well, it sounds like part of what you're saying also is kind of your expectation for what you want to happen from this dialogue. Is it convince them, or is it at least have an opportunity to express my position?
Right, exactly. And I think that also goes into perhaps in today's day and age, especially when everyone is so ideological, how we ourselves can stay engaged and not be exhausted. It can be kind of exhausting if we go into every
You expect to
conversation.
convert the other person, yeah.
Right, to convert the other person. And if they're not convinced, then we feel like, well, we failed in our role, right? Whereas perhaps if we viewed it from an advocacy perspective, it might not feel that way because we've been given the opportunity to express our views in a way that hopefully the other person will listen. So yeah, just curious as to what our panelists might have to add on that, or yeah.
Okay, great. Andrew, you have a hand up.
Oh yeah. Well, I think I can answer that and say what I was going to say simultaneously somehow. Or I'll try it and maybe we'll get there. I think you know, I make this point. I make this point on my my Instagram and my I might even say it on my Substack. You know, I don't argue with true believers, right? And when I say that, I mean I'm not going to like fight with ideologues on the internet because it's pointless, right? um, and there's a real this was like a lesson that I had to learn from years of fighting with friends on the internet who disagree with me about things. That the way that you get people out of like the clutches of ideology, and I that to me is the goal. I guess if there's a degree of advocacy, it's for leaving ideology entirely. Um, you have to have like a close connection with that person, and you have to it's a long process. There's a guy, Stephen Hassan, who's the he's like this cult expert, um, and he talks about like the way to get people out of a cult is you don't berate them, right? You don't attack the cult, you don't attack the beliefs of the cult, all of that kind of stuff. You just be their friend, and you what that does is it creates a person who's outside the cult who's a good person to them, and it creates cognitive dissonance that they can't resolve, right? And that is a long process, right? And so if we're talking about like um, if we're talking about how to change people's minds, and if that's the goal, and versus advocacy, I would say that the biggest thing is, number one, to get people out of those ideologies to the point where we're actually advocating, right? Where our activism is about specific things. And as somebody, and I can't remember who it was, said something about like an activist being somebody who has like a particular goal in mind, right? Like a particular policy goal. And like that's where our activism should be, not activism in the name of our groups, but activism towards particular policy goals, right? And the only way that we're going to get there is if we can draw people out of those ideological, echo chambers by engaging with them in this very personal way. So that's my spiel on how to change minds.
Great. No,
Yeah, no, I'll probably just bounce off a lot of what Andrew said. It's like, yeah, yeah. In my mind, I agree that I think an activist, it's like, uh, well, let me just say this and then I'll go into that. But an activist is somebody who has some specific change that they're trying to bring about for whatever reason, which is probably some reason that's personal to them and their own experience. But you have some specific change that you're trying to bring about, which is usually uh, expressed ultimately in the form of maybe some kind of policy change or something that you're advocating for. And I have a couple thoughts on this. One is I was last year I was discussing with somebody who works in a think tank in DC, and he pretty much is very focused on trying to bring about a change in some economic policy. I won't go into the details, but I was sort of talking to him about this, about like what is it like being so laser focused day in and day out on this one thing, writing about it, going to talks about it, trying to talk to policymakers about it, and it's like it just doesn't move, like it's not happening. And one thing he said really struck with me. He's like, the policy change is the final domino. Right? That's like the last thing that happens, right? And everything else is the work up until then, and that's all serious work. I think an activist is somebody who has taken up that as like a role, as a task, right? Which means they're devoting time, energy, resources to that. Not just somebody who's passionate about something, but somebody who's decided to, like, take up that responsibility. And I think in a democracy, it's a little bit harder because the public is an active participant in policymaking. We're not an aristocracy. Some people will argue deep state, et cetera, or whatever. But as far as I know, we're not we're not an aristocracy. We're a democracy, and that means there's a lot going on. People are focused on so many things. Policymakers are focused on so many things. Regular people are getting pulled in so many directions, and there's some piece of reality that's very salient to you, and you think it's very important. Maybe it's being underappreciated, and you want people to appreciate it more because you think it's very important. That's like slow, boring type of work, and I think if that's something you want to do, um, uh, you should sort of understand the reality of that, and you have to try to. I think it's important to also try to explain your position to the public as well, because they're an active participant in policymaking in a democracy. And so, um, yeah, it's a tough task. It's not easy, and uh, thinking that you're gonna like change people's minds just like that on some issue where maybe they didn't know anything about it, or they've invested deeply emotionally, intellectually in some other perspective on it. um, I'm not sure that's very realistic, unless you're like a magician or something. I think it's tough work. That's all I'll say.
Yeah, I mean, certainly giving yourself that expectation or as a goal, that could be pretty difficult. Probably not the best thing to do, right? I mean, try to have your goal be to understand more, right? That's always easier, right? I mean, I like to think about this idea. I like to talk to people about this idea of, instead of going into an adversarial conversation or something, try to go into like, let's do this together. Let's be on the same side to understand each other better, right? And understand, like, we're on a detective mission to understand why we don't see this the same way. And then you're at least not starting right off that there's a winner and a loser in that conversation, right? Which is often where we usually start, right? I'm going to go win this conversation, baby. I got the better facts, man. I got the facts this time. That's probably our biggest problem, right? Or the biggest, most common thing you see. So I wanted to kind of wrap up. We're coming up to an extra half an hour here. I really appreciate folks hanging around. I wanted to kind of wrap up with this basic, kind of consensus, right? I think, we've had a consensus that you can do bridge building and, sort of advocacy too. But like, what are some like should I do that? How do I, I'm still back to that question a little bit. What do you tell somebody that's out there going, why do I want to talk to anybody about bridge building? We kind of covered in the beginning because potentially it makes you a better advocate because you can understand your adversaries better. Is there any more? Like, people are going, but, well, you know what? I will show this one little chart from this PowerPoint, or from this. It was from a research I just recently shared or found, and And so the what I was going to show was I think it's the interesting part of this, and hopefully it's big enough that folks can kind of see it. The interesting part of this to me is it might be a little hard to see, but if the red line is this is different groups and how they rate the democracy level on a scale of like 0 to 100 for where is the U.S. in terms of being a democracy or not. The green line at the top is the experts. The red line is Republicans. The blue line is Democrats, and this purple line, if you can see it, is the public. And I don't exactly know what that means because I didn't dive completely into that. But I thought what was particularly interesting is these perceptions, right? You see the red line when Biden comes in, democracy tanks, right? And from their perception, right? We've lost democracy now because and that proceeds through the Biden years. Or on the other way, the blue line shoots up, right? So they're almost like inverted. Once Biden comes in, the Democrats think democracy is pretty good. But you'll also notice that this perception between what the experts think, they're much more optimistic than either group, right? They're both groups are way below the experts. And then when you get to 2024, we see the opposite, right? Now the Democrats of democracy's gone, they shoot to low. But you see Republicans, they're not. They went the other way. Like they think democracy has improved since the inauguration, right? Now a big difference there is these experts, which kind of gets to something that you were saying, Zach, about you might be right, that one side is worse, but you can still be more effective doing this in non-polarizing ways. And so I don't know if anybody has any comments on that. I think it's interesting. It's a good way to remember that these perceptions can be way off between these groups, right? And I kind of don't want to take up the whole. Well, I don't know. I guess I can leave this up on the screen for a little while. Anyone want to kind of jump on that a little bit for any final thoughts?
Yeah, I can chime in, David. I love this graph. I think it's super interesting. It's pretty much a mirror image of public market sentiment by political affiliation. Same thing, where whenever Republicans in office, Republicans think the economy is doing great and is going to continue to do great, and then Democrats are way below, and then the president changes party and it completely flips. And so super, super interesting. It gets at what we've talked about a few times here, that reality is often very different than perceived reality, especially whenever you get into these ideological echo chambers. The very first question we had from the comment section was about the appeal of ideology, even when the ideology doesn't reflect reality, and that is obvious. So super, super interesting question. And I think it maps really well into both this graph and the market sentiment graph. But I mean, very clearly people, are missing something in their lives, right? And David, I think we've talked about this before, that, one of the most appealing things that someone can devote their lives to is a good versus evil struggle, right? There's a very innate desire to be a part of something bigger than yourself and to fight, an evil other. And for a lot of people, as religion has declined, politics has taken that mantle. And so as recently as 1999, 70% of Americans belonged to a religious institution. They were members of a church or synagogue or something. And just in the last 25 years, that's fallen to like 47, 48% or something like that. So Ryan Burge on Substack, he's got a great Substack called Graphs About Religion, and goes into this in detail like you wouldn't believe. But it's fascinating because it's quite literally the largest religious shift in American history, 40 million Americans leaving the church. And with that, gap in meaning, right? And what is it that you are devoting your life to? A lot of people have stepped into politics, right? And Robert Putnam talks about, a similar related issue in that community, right, has really dropped off kind of since a similar time frame, since the 90s. The horizontal communities that we've talked about earlier have really struggled. And so people replace that, again, horizontal community with vertical ideological communities politically. And what that means is that whenever your group believes something, even if it doesn't purport to reality, it's better for you to also agree with that company line to signal group loyalty. And if you do that, especially if it doesn't purport with reality, then you have cemented yourself in that group. And for people who are desperately seeking group and community, as well as an other to fight, that's a very, very attractive proposition, right? dispense with reality and facts on the ground, and instead embrace, group tribalism and the attack on the other, and that's a very attractive worldview to live in for a lot of people. And so, why do we do depolarization work? Because obviously, that's a very dangerous way to think. But we also have to be cognizant of the fact that it's a very attractive worldview for a reason, and that if we're going to compete with that, we have to be aware of those underlying drivers and make sure that depolarization work itself likewise can compete on the level of good versus evil narrative and community building type narratives that the very polarized fringes of the left and right are offering. So lots to think about there. I think this is an awesome graph. But to wrap it all up, I do think the work that we're doing is very important, and it's just very wise for us to remember what we're competing against whenever we're doing this work. So I'll wrap up there.
Great, thank you, Jake.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one observation about this this chart, and it's that expert opinion and Democrat opinion more or less track one another. When Democrats think that democracy is under threat, so do the experts. And so we can either imagine that all people who vote for Democrats are just really aligned with the truth, and the Republicans have got it all wrong, or what we could do is notice that experts all the institutions for producing expertise have really become dominated by the left. And so that, in fact, what you're seeing with that expert line is you're seeing essentially a partisan reaction to the election of Donald Trump, right? And this points to one of the reasons that we're so divided, and one of the reasons we're having this sort of civil war that we're in right now. And it's that the people, to the right can see. It's not just they're not imagining things. They can see that they've been shut out. Their interests, their priorities, their perspectives, their values have been systematically shut out of the elite institutions of our society that produce experts, produce expert opinions. And we talked earlier about this crisis of trust. We're in this post-trust era. Well, this is a big part of it, right? There's sort of half of society says, your so-called experts are just a bunch of partisan hacks. Why the hell should I trust them? And so I think one big picture, one of the ways we're going to solve this sort of problem that we're in right now, one of the conflict that we're in, is by giving everyone in American society a voice, or at least a perception that they have a voice, that their interests and priorities are being represented in these institutions. And I'm talking about academia, where I teach, media, nonprofits. And I think one of the things we see with the Trump administration right now is I would say a very ham-fisted attempt to achieve that kind of balance, right? Attacking the academic institutions and whatnot. But yeah, just to sum up, I think we're not going to solve our problems until all sort of segments of American society have a sense that they have a stake in these institutions, that they're being represented by these institutions, and where you don't get charts like this, where when a Republican wins, all the experts conclude that it's the end of democracy. I think that's a big society-wide, problem we've got to deal with.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, and we did an episode about that, as you may know, with Lawrence, right? Lawrence Shepard. And I love that episode, actually. But yeah, and what I'll say about that, I do know a little bit about those numbers. The experts in this case are like, it's political scientists. I think it was 500. It's something like 500 political scientists, and yeah, and it was like 78% or something like that. Are kind of in this. They say we're in an autocracy right now, and it's interesting. 78%
and it's
probably
probably
aligned.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead.
go ahead. Sorry. I was going to say 78% are probably also like Democrat or to the left of Democrats, right?
Well,
Yeah.
political science tends to not be quite that much as some of the other social sciences. But yeah, but then I was going to say about that is like, so I also read some of those sort of dissenting, right? You got the other, 20-ish% that were dissenting, right? So I read some of the things that they wrote, and they speak, to this issue that that they're kind of in line and in sync with with sort of the left movement. But it's so I will say another thing that's interesting about that. And again, I don't put a lot of faith in these dashed lines that go out to 2027. But it's interesting that the way they drew that dashed line, they have um, the green line goes below the popular. Gets worse than never before. In the history was the experts' assessment worse than the populist, right? And they show that happening. Again, I wouldn't put a lot of confidence in those dashed lines, but yeah, go ahead, Nimai. I think you're muted.
Just wanted to kind of respond to this and offer a closing thought. And this is a little bit of CYA on my part, in the sense I want to respond to. I think Cameron was bringing up this point, kind of related to this chart of just how we're currently in this, um, uh, in this moment where I think a lot of people are sort of like dejected and maybe a little bit depressed and cynical and not kind of like understanding, what's the way through all this. And it's a very, I think it's like actually a very complicated problem. There's like this tendency to like want to find a simple answer, but all the things Jake talked about, I think some of the psychological tendencies that Travis just mentioned, like this is all like mixed up and happening simultaneously, and that's why it's like a very hazy kind of a thing. And I think I've been a little kumbaya with some of my answers. I don't want to I don't want to give the impression that I don't think it's easy, and I share a lot of that sense of kind of a little bit of depression and sort of like what the hell, but I also think that kind of the solution is actually like going back to the basics. I think there's a tendency to want to find shortcuts, and I think that because you just want the problem to resolve, and that shortcut tendency naturally like turns your eyes towards like, let me and my team grab power, let's dominate for a little while, and then we'll set everything straight. And I'm not I don't think that gets us there. I think the sort of uh, just to sort of close on this thought, I think I think the founders were sort of aware that the people in power will try to abuse it in all kinds of ways. I mean, I think Marbury versus Madison is one of like the most interesting episodes from history. That's like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams themselves making a bit of a mockery of like constitutional norms. And these were the guys who fought for it. Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, but then when ideological camps suddenly start fighting, people will try to cut corners and things of that nature if you study the history of that. So it's very innate once in the institutions of power for people to want to find shortcuts to like put forward their program, and they may actually think they're doing it for the right reasons. But I think the way the U.S. is set up is that the people are the sovereign, and it's like our responsibility to put a check on those government institutions. And I think one way of thinking about a lot of the kind of crisis that we're in is like the sovereign is sort of confused and missing in action a little bit, in the sense, um, there's like two fundamental responsibilities of the sovereign. One is they need to understand reality, so you can make a good judgment on whether the people in power are doing the right thing, and then they need to be able to coordinate. These are two very, very difficult things to do on their own. And uh, the whole idea was the system will work if the people actually choose to like get good at those two skills. And I think uh, uh, a lot of the solution is in actually just going back to the basics and trying to do that, trying to coordinate with the people around you, trying to sort of figure out how can we sort of work together, understand one another, and then how do I actually understand what's going on, not getting dragged into these sensationalist headlines and epistemic silos, but really like have a kind of epistemic integrity and try to figure out what is actually going on. And then that has to happen at scale. And that's like just a hard thing to do. But I think that is the sustainable solution. And that's just wanted to say that.
Yeah, if I could just jump on what Nimai is saying. That's I think this is the key thing that like the main problem that we're dealing with in all of this is that uh, that organization or that coordinating behavior problem. That's what like ideology is supposed to do. That's what it is. That's what it's a tool for, right? Is to coordinate behavior at a large scale. And that tool is at this point obsolete, right? It just can't, like the ideological sort of system can't coordinate behavior to tackle the problems that we have that have this kind of global scope and scale. It's made for getting soldiers together to go like conquer another country, right? It's not made for global pandemics, and it's not made for pollution or man-made problems with our environment, and all these kinds of these just enormous, amazingly complex and vast problems and issues that we're contending with at this point. And I think, again, Emma's exactly right, that the way to deal with that is to get back to the basics of like bringing it down. I know I've harped on this a bunch, but bringing it down to the issue level and contending with those issues on their own terms. So yeah, that's my spiel, my other spiel.
Okay. Anybody else have any wrap-up comments? Kelly, you got anything for us?
Well, I'll just wrap up. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm here in Northern Virginia, so it's getting close to my bedtime here. But just a couple of things. Getting back to your question, David, about kind of where we have some common ground. I just wanted to kind of wrap that up and maybe make one somewhat dissenting point to what Karen said about debate. I was a high school and college debater as well, and I think debate training is fabulous. In fact, I would require it for everybody to graduate from high school for one reason, not because it is the model for communicating or the model for civility. It is actually in many respects, but it forces you, at least if the rules are still the same as they were when I debated back in the late Cretaceous period, you have to learn and be willing and able to argue both sides of a question. And to me, that exercise and experience forces you to do serious research, have your facts together, and also, again, be able to articulate the reasons for both sides. It helps you understand both sides, which is a big problem in our universe now when we're all becoming too tribal, too much in our bubbles, a lack of interaction with people across the other side in a very friendly, open way. We agree on local issues. We've got a big local issue where I live here about my nearby town trying to eliminate its police department. It's a big deal. I think also starting with your neighbors and being personal. I would also say we are way over politicized in our society, which starts without the politics. In fact, I make a point of beginning every conversation I have with family and friends, never being the first to bring up politics, even though it's been my career and my avocation for many years. I think we talked about building trust. That is so essential. You can't really get anywhere unless you build that trust. An old friend of mine, Ed Goes, and Linda Lake wrote a great book. Many people may have read this, A Question of Respect, where Ed has done some polling work with Linda Lake, bipartisan pollsters on this area of civility. And if you're not familiar with it, I strongly encourage you to read that book, because it will help you understand some of the survey work, much like this is here. One thing I'll note about your chart, David, and I'll get off the line here, the margin of difference really hasn't changed over the last time period. I wish this chart could go back another 30 or 40 years, but even though the positions have changed, or it's not that much, 10 point, 15 point difference. And I'm struck by more people who are on the outside of those barriers. The number of Republicans, for example, who think democracy is a threat, or Democrats who don't think it's a threat. I mean, or just don't know. And that may be where we are. So I think and I think that's where the thirst is with so many of our citizens, of trying to figure out, how do we debate better? How do we discuss better? How do we change our politics and change our culture so we don't have the outrage systems being rewarded? And that's my last point, I would say. And I don't think people agree with me on this one, but that which gets rewarded gets repeated. Our culture, our social media rewards too much of the bad thing and not enough of the good thing. And I'd like to find a way for us to encourage, especially on social media. We're stuck in, as Travis said, in this vertical neighborhood community of sorts, and we've really got to change. That's where the outrage and a lot of the fomenting comes from, a lot of the division comes from. And so I would love to figure out a way to change that equilibrium where we're now rewarding behavior that really supports the kind of discussion. I'm not into changing anybody's mind anymore. I just want to change the way we debate and the way we discuss, so people don't hate each other. They respect each other. They learn from each other. They do their homework. They bring facts to the table. They're careful when they say things. They leave profanity outside the table. I know it makes me very old-fashioned, but I think that's a big turnoff in my world. So those are some things that I think where a lot of people, from my perspective, are at, that just want to change the way we debate. So we debate we learn from each other and we respect each other and we make our communities and our neighborhoods better places to live.
Yeah, that's great. And that's a good point about that debate thing. That idea of having to defend something that isn't your natural position, kind of the steelman argument idea, right? I mean, we're not that good at it because it's hard. We don't like it. It's not fun. It makes us sort of destabilizing, but it's a great exercise to do. Yeah.
Yeah. The model isn't the debate in terms of civility. It's really the interview. And so that's why I have great admiration for people that interview well, like my friend Hugh Hewitt, a radio talk show guy. He's the most civil, conservative radio host in the country by far. Treats everybody with great respect, and I give him as a model. But if we would, and I think it's also kind of why long form interview podcasts have become so popular with so many people, because you really get to learn. You can really explore the authenticity of people and bring out their real points of view and engagement. So I think that what people are really searching for is that kind of engagement. And that's something we can learn from.
Awesome. All right. Well, I know we've gone pretty long, so I'm happy to wrap up there, unless anybody else has any final thoughts to close out with. I just want to really thank everybody. And I think that was a good discussion. Hopefully we helped with the original question we had. I think anybody that wants to share in the Zoom chat, or if you, I can also put things in the YouTube if somebody wants to do that. If you wanted to share anything with the YouTube crowd, but yeah, I really appreciate everybody joining in and making time for this. I know you all have really busy schedules. You could be doing something much more important in your life probably than hanging around with me. But I really do appreciate it, and I certainly learned a lot, and I'm really glad you were able to participate and provide all those insights. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone, and take care, everybody on YouTube.
Thanks, y'all.
Chad.